Good morning. My name is Kitty Kurth, and I have worked with Paul Rusesabagina to try to bring truth and reconciliation to the Great Lakes region of Africa for more than 15 years. Today, we find ourselves here because he was kidnapped, wrongfully imprisoned, and faced to force a sham trial at the hands of the Rwandan government. Next week, the Rwandan government is starting an appeal process. We'll be explaining what that process is and how we got here. At the end of the press conference, we will take questions. There is a question and answer function down in the right-hand portion of your screen. Please put any questions that you have in there. During the course of the press conference, there will be portions that will be translated in both English and French. Bear with us. We'll try to get all of the information presented to you clearly in both English and French. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Brian Endless to talk about what's happened to Paul Rusesabagina.
Thank you, Kitty, and thank you all very much for joining us. As Kitty mentioned, my name is Brian Endless. I have worked with Paul in the Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation for over 15 years now, and it has been an honor to work with his family and team since he was kidnapped 505 days ago and taken to Rwanda. As you all know, unfortunately, Paul was subjected to torture, to solitary confinement, and to a sham trial that lasted over 6 months. The trial ended on September 20th with a guilty verdict and a sentence of 25 years in prison. Something that's very important to remember: this was not a fair trial in any objective sense. This was a trial of a political prisoner by an authoritarian government in Rwanda. The process of the trial, with Paul's fair trial rights denied over and over in the course of the proceedings, was insane to watch. Paul withdrew from the proceedings within the first month when he saw that there was not going to be anything resembling fairness or justice in this trial. With the guilty verdict, international observers, human rights organizations, and governments all came out to confirm the unfair nature of this trial. Trial Watch, an organization set up by the American Bar Association and Clooney Foundation for Justice, was an independent observer of the trial, and I think they summed it up nicely. They argued that the verdict was predetermined, and as noted British barrister Geoffrey Robertson states, the trial of Paul Rusesabagina has degenerated into a, quote, show trial, unquote, in which no challenge is permitted to undermine the state's story. This was a trial of a political prisoner on trumped-up charges. Given that, Paul, his family, and his legal team see no reason to appeal, since there is no reason to believe that justice will be served or that the Rwandan government will change its mind. The only appeal being made right now is one by the Rwandan government. To add insult to injury, the prosecutors have appealed the verdict. Paul is 68 years old, and they have said that his 25-year sentence is too lenient and that it should be changed to a life sentence. We'll talk about the appeal today and provide a small update on other activities in our efforts to free Paul Rusesabagina, and then we'll end with questions. To begin today, I would like to introduce one of our international lawyers who has worked extensively in Rwanda, Kate Gibson. Kate, please tell us about the appeal and what's happening right now.
Thanks very much, Brian, and thank you to everyone who's come to join and engage with us today as we start this new year, 2022, with Paul still in prison and in an increasingly precarious situation. So what has happened since we all last spoke? We finally managed to get a copy of the judgment against Paul, and it's really actually quite hard to read what's supposed to be a legal judicial document, but that's based on such obvious errors of law and errors of fact. But more than that, is based on these real distortions of the evidence that was heard in the case. And that's not my opinion. The trial is online. You can watch it, everyone can watch it, and you can see, for example, you know, one of Paul's co-accused telling the judges Paul had nothing to do with the creation of the FLN, but then in the judgment, the judge is saying that this co-accused said Paul created the FLN. You know, the distortions are that obvious. They're that bad. And I would love nothing more than to spend the next hour taking you through them all one by one, but, you know, we'd be here forever. And in any event, as Brian mentioned, the independent monitors from the Clooney Foundation for Justice and the American Bar Association's Human Rights Centre are coming out in the coming days with the Trial Watch report, in which they'll set out their independent analysis of the trial and the judgment. And we'd urge you to read it when it comes out, as we will, and form your own views. But I will say this, although the judgment is shocking to read, what was completely unsurprising to us was the extent to which the judges were forced to rely on this document that Paul signed on the 31st of August after he'd been tortured for 4 days and wasn't given access to a lawyer, wasn't given access to anyone. And there's just no legal system on earth that purports to comply with the rule of law that would admit and rely on a document that was obtained under torture in those circumstances. But in Paul's case, that document is at the heart of the judgment against him, because there really is nothing else. Is this appeal process that starts next week a chance for the Rwandan judiciary to fix some of the errors that happened at trial? No. Today in Kigali, Paul's Rwandan lawyer visited him in prison. This Rwandan lawyer is still completely barred from bringing in or taking out any documents, any materials, or even notes. Any document that he does turn up with is confiscated and read by the prison authorities. This means that Paul just can't engage in any legal process, whether in Rwanda or internationally, and this is deliberate. Paul is treated differently from every other prisoner at Mageragere prison. Anyone who is saying otherwise or pretending that Paul is now being afforded his rights as an accused is either mistaken or lying. And in these circumstances, it was entirely unsurprising to us that Paul has maintained his decision not to engage in any way with the judicial process that's going on in Rwanda, which is so flawed and so unfair. And more than that, really undermines all the progress that Rwanda made in claiming to be a country that could administer fair trials. Because the rights of an accused, of anyone accused of a crime, are fundamental. And when Paul was kidnapped and brought to Rwanda, many people, me included, really thought that the Rwandan judiciary and the National Public Prosecution authorities would bend over backwards to give Paul the fairest of fair trials. And it would have been such an easy thing to give Paul a copy of his case file, to give him the list of witnesses, not to confiscate his privileged documents, not to harass his lawyers, to allow him to have privileged conversations. These are easy things. These are basic things. They're prerequisite components of any impartial, independent legal system. But huge mistakes were made by the Rwandans. They can't be corrected. It's simply too late. And in any event, they are ongoing, as we see with today's legal visit in Kigali. Nothing has changed. The only path for us now is to work together with organisations, with governments in Belgium, in Europe, in the United States, to work to ensure his immediate release. And this is becoming more and more urgent with every day that passes for the reasons that his family will explain to you. But first, if you'll permit, Cécile will translate what I've just said in French before we hand to the family.
Bonjour à tous, je vais maintenant traduire ce que Maître Gibson vient d'expliquer. Merci à vous d'être venus prendre part à notre discussion d'aujourd'hui, alors que nous commençons cette nouvelle année 2022 avec Paul toujours en prison et dans une situation de plus en plus précaire. Alors, que s'est-il passé depuis la dernière fois où nous avons parlé? D'abord, nous avons finalement été en mesure d'obtenir une copie écrite du jugement rendu contre Paul. Et il est vraiment difficile de lire ce qui est censé être un document légal, mais qui se révèle rempli d'erreurs juridiques évidentes, d'erreurs factuelles, mais au-delà de ça, la déformation flagrante des preuves. Et ça, ce n'est pas juste mon opinion juridique sur la question. L'intégralité du procès est en ligne, donc vous pouvez le regarder et n'importe qui peut aller consulter les vidéos. On peut y voir par exemple un des co-accusés de Paul qui dit « Paul n'a rien à voir avec la création du FLN ». Et puis dans le jugement, les juges décident que ce co-accusé a déclaré que Paul avait créé le FLN. Il y a beaucoup de déformations de la réalité évidente ou de changements qui sont graves. Et j'aimerais pouvoir les passer tous en revue ici, mais nous y passerions forcément des heures. Donc le plus important, comme Brian l'a mentionné, c'est que la Fondation Clooney pour la justice et le Centre des droits de l'homme de l'Association du barreau américain vont publier un rapport sur le procès, Trial Watch, dans les prochains jours, dans lequel ils offrent une analyse indépendante du procès et du jugement. Et donc, nous vous invitons à lire attentivement, comme nous allons le faire, une fois que ça sera publié, et de pouvoir faire votre propre opinion sur la question et sur cette affaire. Je dirais cependant ceci, bien que le jugement soit choquant à lire, ce qui n'est absolument pas surprenant, c'est la mesure dans laquelle les juges ont été forcés de s'appuyer sur le document que Paul a signé le 31 août, c'est-à-dire après avoir subi 4 jours de torture et après n'avoir jamais eu accès à un avocat ou à qui que ce soit d'autre. Il n'y a aucun système juridique au monde conforme à l'état de droit qui admettrait ou s'appuierait sur une déclaration faite dans de telles circonstances. Dans le cas de Paul, la déclaration, donc ce document, est au cœur du jugement contre lui. Et pourquoi? Parce qu'il n'y a vraiment aucune autre preuve. Alors, le processus d'appel qui commence la semaine prochaine, est-ce que c'est une chance pour le système judiciaire rwandais de corriger certaines de ses erreurs? Non. Si on prend l'exemple d'aujourd'hui, à Kigali, Paul a reçu la visite de son avocat rwandais. Cet avocat n'a toujours pas le droit d'apporter des documents ou même de prendre des notes. Tout ce qu'il apporte est confisqué et lu par les autorités pénitentiaires, ce qui signifie que Paul ne peut s'engager dans aucune procédure judiciaire au Rwanda ou à l'étranger. Et c'est délibéré. Paul est traité différemment de tous les autres prisonniers de la prison de Mageragere. Quiconque affirme le contraire ou prétend que Paul bénéficie pleinement de l'exercice de ses droits, ou bien se trompe ou ment tout simplement. Dans ces circonstances, nous ne sommes pas du tout surpris que Paul ait maintenu sa décision de ne pas se réengager dans le processus judiciaire rwandais, qui est fondamentalement injuste et partial, et pire encore, qui sape tous les progrès réalisés par le Rwanda, qui prétend être un pays capable d'offrir des procès équitables. Les droits d'un accusé, de toute personne accusée d'un crime, sont fondamentaux. Lorsque Paul a été kidnappé, nombreux étaient ceux qui pensaient que les autorités judiciaires et le ministère public rwandais se plieraient en 4 pour que Paul bénéficie du procès le plus équitable qui soit. Il aurait été bien sûr extrêmement facile de donner à Paul le dossier de l'affaire, de lui donner la liste des témoins, de ne pas confisquer les documents confidentiels, de ne pas harceler ses avocats et de lui permettre d'avoir des conversations téléphoniques soumises au secret professionnel. ce sont des choses basiques, ce sont des choses fondamentales et des éléments nécessaires à un système juridique compétent, indépendant et impartial. D'énormes erreurs ont été commises, elles ne peuvent être corrigées et de toute façon, elles se poursuivent encore aujourd'hui. Rien n'a changé. La seule voie qui s'offre à nous maintenant est celle de la concertation avec les gouvernements en Belgique, ailleurs en Europe et aux États-Unis pour assurer la libération immédiate de Paul. Et cela devient encore plus urgent chaque jour qui passe et pour les raisons que sa famille va maintenant vous exposer.
Thank you very much, Kate, and also thank you, Cecile, for the translation. At this point, we would like to move on to Paul's daughters, Karine and Anais Knimba, and we'd like to ask them just for very brief updates on what's happening with Paul's case in Europe and the United States. Karine, maybe if you could start off with Europe.
Yes, thank you, Brian. The European Parliament remains very engaged in the fight for our father's release, especially after they adopted a resolution, second resolution last October, calling for Dad's immediate release and repatriation back home. We hope that the European Commission will also join them soon. We're so very pleased that the United Kingdom is now involved in Dad's case. The United Kingdom Parliament last month proposed Magnitsky sanctions against the Rwandan government officials that are responsible for the kidnapping and torture of our father. And interestingly, one of those individuals is the former Rwandan Minister of Justice, Johnson Busingye, who was nominated by the Rwandan government to become the next ambassador to the United Kingdom. However, the parliamentarians in Westminster Hall last month made it very clear that they were opposed to this nomination and have called on the United Kingdom government to refuse the nomination of Johnson Busingye as the next UK ambassador, Rwandan ambassador to the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karine. Anais, if you can give us a brief update on what's happening in the United States, please.
Hi, everyone. Happy New Year. So in the United States, we are actually very engaged as well. We are getting started with the new year as people come from the holidays. We're planning briefings in Capitol Hill, State Department. We remain very engaged with State Department on a daily basis. We're also looking at new areas where we're going to be working. We're going to be engaging more with the White House over the next few months. And then we hope to give you some update and a larger update in the next couple of weeks as we expect some bigger things. But we are really engaged, and again, we remain thankful for all the support that we receive from the US government, specifically the US Congress, State Department, and the White House until now.
Thank you very much, Anais. Finally, before we move to Q&A, I'd like to introduce Paul's oldest daughter, Lise Rusesabagina, and she'll talk to us a little bit about Paul's extremely concerning health condition. Lise.
Yes, thank you, Brian. As you know, Dad's medicine were immediately sent after his kidnapping, and unfortunately, they were confiscated. Now, we don't know what he takes. He doesn't also knows, but what we know, whatever he takes doesn't work. He always suffers from headaches. Recently, he told us that he is becoming more and more weak, and he has lost weight. So the family and the whole team, we are very worried because his life is deteriorating day by day.
Thank you very much for the update, Lisa. Very much appreciate it. And we all have incredible concerns about Paul. He, as I mentioned, is a 68-year-old man who has effectively been sentenced to life in prison. It is objectively considered one of the worst prison systems in the world, and his health has been deteriorating ever since the trial began. The family has serious concerns for his life while he's in prison. As we go into the Q&A, I'd like to kick it back to Kitty Kurth to once again give us the brief instructions and to get us started. Kitty.
Any questions that audience members have, you can put in the Q&A function at the right-hand bottom of your screen. But to get us started, Kate, I would like to go to you to explain a little bit about what we think we can expect from the Rwandan appeals process and what we think might happen over the next few weeks.
Thanks very much, Kitty. As Brian alluded to, the prosecution is seeking an increase in sentence from Paul's sentence from 25 years to a life sentence. So that we know for certain, that the prosecution will be making legal and factual submissions to try to convince the Court of Appeal judges in Rwanda to increase the sentence. Outside of that, even though Paul is the subject of this appeal, after the trial phase, the Rwandan authorities cut our lawyers access to the case file. So it's difficult for us to have any real knowledge of what the other parties will be arguing on appeal. What we do know, though, is because there are 20 other co-accused in this case, and there are also a large number of civil parties who are participating, our legal team in Rwanda anticipates that the hearing might go on for several weeks or even months. We need to keep in mind that the Court of Appeal in Rwanda isn't just hearing this case, and so we can't expect that this appeal will be scheduled every day. It might, in fact, be dragged out over the course of several weeks and months. And we anticipate that that might be the case because it gives the press and the authorities in Rwanda to say Rusesabagina and terrorism in the same sentence over a longer period of time. One of the questions that we have as the legal team is whether or not the appeal process will be broadcast. As you know, the entire trial process was broadcast live through the Rwandan Judiciary's YouTube channel, which was extraordinary. You know, this was unique to Rwanda. We haven't seen any other trials broadcast to that extent to the outside world. We haven't received any official indication yet that this will be the same for the appeal, but we'd hope to find that out over the next few days. I think that's probably all the information that I have about what we can expect.
Kate, I think you actually answered my next question, which was, is this appeal really about a legal process, or is this appeal about the Rwandan government getting another bite at the apple because they weren't happy with the press coverage of the trial and they know that they lost face in the eyes of the international community? Are they just trying to have another chance to whitewash their reputation?
I mean, that was such a beautifully formed leading question, Kitty, that I think I just need to say yes. I think that's right. As a team, we've sort of long given up trying to decipher the motivations that are prompting the actions of the judicial authorities in Rwanda. I see a related question in the chat from Michaela about whether the legal team has any idea what prompted the prosecutor's appeal, which seems a pretty unusual move, which is a nice understatement, legally speaking. I mean, I've been working on cases involving Rwanda since 2005, and I've never seen anything like a prosecuting authority who received a 25-year sentence for a 68-year-old man. That's a sentence that effectively means that unless the international community acts, that Paul will die in prison. I mean, that's what we're talking about. But that for them to expend the state's resources in a situation where their legal system is so incredibly backed up because of delays due to COVID, to use the legal sources, a lot of which are being given to them from outside states, to then try and seek an increase that has no practical effect, leads us to the inevitable conclusion that this was not a legal decision. It was not a decision motivated by anything other than wanting to keep this trial in the spotlight and try to emphasize for the international community who's been so critical that a life sentence is the only thing that's acceptable in this situation.
Thank you. The next question deals with whether it would be possible to get an op-ed or anything, any kind of direct testimony from Paul about his situation and his treatment. And I'll go ahead and answer it. Paul has not been allowed to have the lawyers bring any documents into him, nor are they allowed to bring any documents out. Kate, I understand he's not even allowed to have a pencil and paper. And the only testimony that we've been able to get, the best testimony we've been able to get about his treatment is through verbal statements to his lawyers, but also through the interview that Abdi Latif Dahir from the New York Times did very early on with Paul.
That's exactly right, Kitty. And to come back to Katrina's question, which is a very good one, in a normal situation, as Paul's lawyer, one of the first things I would have done would be go and sit with him in prison and ask him to go minute by minute through what had happened to him from the moment of his kidnapping till when we finally met. Before Paul's trial, international lawyers like myself, whether or not they were members of the Rwandan bar, were always allowed to go to Rwanda and represent international accused, including high-profile political detainees like Victoire Ingabire, who was represented by a barrister from the Bar of England and Wales and a Dutch lawyer, neither of whom were members of the Rwandan Bar Association. When Paul wrote a letter to the Rwandan bar saying, I would like to designate these international lawyers to come and represent me in the proceedings in Rwanda, the Rwandan Bar Association said they are not permitted to do so because they're not members of the Rwandan bar. So they changed the rules in relation to Paul's case, and we've been unable to have any contact with him or represent him. What we have urged international organizations to do is to independently seek authorization from the Rwandan authorities to go and get the kind of testimony that Katrina is talking about in her question from Paul, which would be the necessary starting point for a lot of the legal channels that we're trying to pursue through the United Nations, through the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, through the Special Rapporteur on Torture. What we need for those kind of special procedures is exactly this, the testimony of Paul minute by minute of what he's suffered since his kidnapping and incarceration. But given that even his two designated Rwandan lawyers can't even take a page of notes when they meet with him, we are at the moment completely blocked from being able to get that kind of testimony, or particularly in affidavit form. And that's deliberate. That's in order to block us from being able to engage with these legal channels internationally that should exist for Paul as they do for any of the other detainees in Rwanda.
Thank you so much, Kate. We have another question from Ambassador Swinen about expressing concerns about what's going on with the diplomatic missions in Kigali. Have they been to visit Paul Rusesabagina? What's happening with them? Corinne or Kate, if you could tell a little bit about what's happening with the Belgian Foreign Ministry. And then the next question is from Tom Zollner about what has the US State Department done? And I'm going to throw that one to Anais to answer.
Yes, so the Belgian Minister of Foreign Affairs has taken our father's case, and the consular team in Rwanda has been going to see Dad. However, the Belgian embassy and the consular team has been unable to get Dad an independent doctor. Despite countless tries, despite searches, we know that the Belgian embassy is having trouble getting our father to see an independent doctor. In addition to this, when they do go to visit him, when they are given the opportunity to go see him at the prison, they're being, their entire conversations is being listened to, monitored, and surveilled. So our father does not feel safe in this environment, and he is looking for the support of the Belgian embassy to give him the opportunity to tell what he has been experiencing in the Rwandan prison.
And Anais, we have a question from Tom Zollner about what has the U.S. been doing, and if you could just tell us a little bit about what the U.S. State Department has been doing on the case.
So the U.S. State Department has taken my father's case officially as the wrongful detention case. And so Ambassador Carstens has worked on the case, and we're very grateful for all their efforts. We know that they're working a lot on this case every day, and we're in communication with them regularly. Unfortunately, it's a slow process, and this is why we're here today and we are still advocating, is because it's a slow process. We're grateful for the efforts put so far, and we're also working with other members of the U.S. government, such as Congress or White House, be able to help the State Department in moving forward with Ambassador Carstens. And so we're very grateful for all the efforts so far, and we encourage them to continue supporting our family and our father as much as they can.
Thank you so much, Anais, Corinne, Lise. Kate, I'm going to go back to you for the last question. We have a question from Professor Bill Israel. Pending the release of the Trial Watch report from the ABA and the Clooney Foundation for Justice, do we have any preliminary informal insight on what the report is likely to say? Or maybe you can just reiterate some of the things that they've already said. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Kitty, and thank you very much, Professor Israel, for the question. The Trial Watch report that we expect in the coming days, we don't know what will be in it. The international monitors who were designated to monitor the case did so independently from us and independently from the Rwandan authorities. And so we'll all be reading it together for the first time when it comes out. But having said that, because of the nature of the violations in Paul's case and how systematic they were, I mean, as many of you know, they really read as sort of a checklist of all the rights that should be afforded to an accused, and none of them were. Because of the extent to which Paul's rights were violated, these independent monitors took the extraordinary step of coming out in advance of the verdict with a preliminary report, so before Paul was convicted, saying, this is what we've seen so far. It's so egregious that any verdict that's rendered in this case will automatically be called into question because of these violations. So I think we can safely assume that the overall Trial Watch report that we expect in the coming days will be along those lines. And it's difficult for us who watched the trial in its entirety, you know, with the family getting up at 3 in the morning in the US to translate for us in real time. It's difficult for us to imagine that the report won't say anything other than what we expect, which is this was a miscarriage of justice, which we all really knew from the moment that instead of pursuing legal available options for Paul's extradition, a deliberate decision was taken to kidnap and torture Paul before putting him on trial. There's no legal process in the world that could be considered fair that starts from that point. So we're really grateful to all the work that's gone on of the monitors for the report that we expect very soon.
Brian, did you have something that you wanted to add to that?
That was basically it, Kitty. This is a situation where we are very appreciative to the American Bar Association and Clooney Foundation. They set up a group called Trial Watch that's doing the monitoring, and they have been able to put in that objective outside perspective on the trial that Kate talked about. We expect the report that comes out from them, hopefully by the end of January, to be very conclusive. And we hope that the international community takes it very seriously from an incredibly well-respected group.
Thank you. And we have one last question from Peter Verlinden, and then I'll wrap it up. The question is Paul having any contact in the prison with other prisoners? Is he safe as far as his food is concerned, for example? And Kate, I think since you have the most experience with Rwandan prisons, I'm going to throw that back to you as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter, for the question. You're asking it because, you know, it's a real concern, Paul's safety in the prison, and we all are living under that cloud every day. The first part of the question in relation to contacts is particularly interesting. You might remember that during the course of last year, we started to make some noise about the fact that Paul was being kept in solitary confinement. So in reality, Paul was kept for 258 days in a cell without any other prisoners. So he was alone and he wasn't having any other human contact. And there are international standards for the treatment of prisoners in detention, the United Nations Nelson Mandela principles, which prohibit that kind of incarceration with no human interaction for longer than 15 days. Anything longer than 15 days is considered torture. Paul was kept without any human contact for 258 days. And after we started to make noise about this, he was transferred to a room with 2 other detainees who he presumed were there to try and get him to incriminate himself and make incriminating statements. His cellmates were regularly swapped out, and Paul certainly had the impression that they weren't real detainees. The situation that he's now in order to avoid Paul being able to say, or us being able to say on his behalf, that he's in solitary confinement, he's allowed to move from his cell and into sort of the general prison population for a limited period per day. But all the other prisoners have been instructed not to talk to him, not to interact with him. So he still doesn't have any human interaction. And heartbreakingly, I think the call before last, so Paul is allowed to call his family for 5 minutes on a Friday. When he spoke to them on the phone, his voice sounded strange. And I think the girl said, why is your voice like that? And he said, oh, I haven't spoken to anyone since I spoke to you last week. You know, he doesn't have any interaction. So as far as we're concerned, he's effectively being held in solitary confinement, which is, you know, universally decried as having a really negative impact on the mental and physical health of detainees. So, you know, the questions that you raise are those that the family and the team struggle with every day, and which is why for us it's so important that organisations and states around the world really redouble their efforts to try and move to his swift release as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Kate. I just want to close by saying that this trial has never been about terrorism or about crimes committed by Paul Rusesabagina. This trial has been, and Paul's entire relationship with Rwanda since 2007, 2005, and before has been about the truth. Paul has used his voice as a survivor of the Rwandan genocide to try to tell the truth to the world about what's happening in Rwanda. And the Rwandan government, from President Paul Kagame on down, has tried to stymie that truth. The very first event that I ever participated in with Paul Rusesabagina, the Rwandan ambassador got up in the middle of the meeting and told lies about Paul Rusesabagina and about 2 American ambassadors. After that meeting, the Rwandan ambassador called and wrote to a reporter who reported on the event, who had been at the event, to say, no, she didn't see what she saw. Here's what she saw. She didn't see what she saw. And the relationship with Rwanda has been the same since then. The Rwandan government lies about Paul Rusesabagina's behavior because they feel threatened by the truth, because they feel threatened by Paul Rusesabagina's existence as someone who's working on behalf of other human rights advocates, who's working to make sure that they don't detain or kill journalists. Don't let the truth be squashed. Paul Rusesabagina is not a terrorist. He's a truth teller. Thank you for joining us today.